October 24th, 1944. A radar screen aboard an American carrier filled with contacts, and the number made no sense. 60 Japanese aircraft, maybe more, heading straight for the fleet. Almost every American fighter was already in the air somewhere else. What the carrier had left was 7 planes, and of those 7, only 2 had the fuel and the position to reach the incoming formation in time. 2 fighters against 60. The man leading them was a Navy pilot named David McCampbell. He climbed above the Japanese formation, looked down at more enemy aircraft than most pilots see in a career, and went in. What happened over the next 90 minutes is one of the best documented feats of aerial combat in history. McCampbell dove, fired, climbed back up, and dove again, hitting the formation from above over and over, while his wingman worked the edges. When he finally landed, out of ammunition and nearly out of fuel, he had shot down 9 enemy aircraft in a single flight. His wingman got 6. No American fighter pilot before or since has shot down 9 planes in one sortie. 2 years earlier, the airplane he was flying didn't exist, and the Japanese pilots who met him that day belonged to an air force that, at the start of the war, had every reason to believe no American fighter could touch them. They had the Zero. The Zero outturned, outclimbed, and outranged everything the Allies could put in the sky, and its pilots knew it. This is the story of how the Americans studied the plane they could not beat, built the machine that would kill it, and turned the most feared fighter in the Pacific into a statistic. When the war in the Pacific began, the Mitsubishi Zero was a genuine shock, and it deserved to be. Allied intelligence had spent years telling itself a comfortable story about Japanese aviation. The planes would be copies of Western designs. The pilots would be second-rate. Then the Zero appeared over China and the Philippines and Pearl Harbor, and every part of that story fell apart at once. The Zero could turn inside anything the Allies flew. It climbed faster. It had range that seemed impossible for a single-engine fighter, which let it appear over targets so far away that defenders assumed it had to be flying from a carrier just over the horizon. In the hands of Japanese naval pilots, many of them with years of combat experience over China, it ran up a record that terrified the men sent to fight it. American pilots learned the hard way. If you tried to dogfight a Zero, you lost. If you tried to turn with it, you lost. The advice passed around the squadrons was blunt and humiliating. Do not fight it the way it wants to fight. Dive away. Run. And the Japanese pilots understood exactly what they had. Their confidence hardened into something close to contempt. The Americans, they believed, built heavy machines flown by amateurs, and there was no reason to expect that to change. But the Zero's greatness had a hidden bill attached, and the Americans were about to read it. Everything that made the Zero brilliant came from one obsession: weight. Its designers stripped it of anything that did not help it turn, climb, or fly far. That meant no armor plate behind the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks, structure built as light as engineering would allow. In 1940, against opponents who couldn't catch it anyway, that trade looked like genius. It also meant the Zero could not take a hit. A short burst from heavy machine guns into a wing tank could turn it into a fireball, because there was nothing to stop the leak and nothing to smother the flame. American pilots who managed to get on a Zero's tail found it came apart with shocking speed. And there were other cracks. The Zero's controls grew stiff and heavy at high speed. It couldn't roll well when it was going fast. It couldn't follow a heavy American fighter into a steep dive. Its early engine would cut out if the pilot pushed the nose down hard because of how the carburetor fed fuel under -G. Then, in July of 1942, the Americans got to inspect all of this at their leisure. A Japanese Zero, flown by a pilot named Tadayoshi Koga, made a forced landing on the island of Akutan in the Aleutians. The soft ground flipped it onto its back and killed the pilot, but the airplane itself came through almost undamaged. American crews recovered it, shipped it home, repaired it, and flew it. That captured Zero is where the myth starts, so let's be careful with it. You will hear that America looked at the Akutan Zero and built the Hellcat to beat it. That is not what happened. The Hellcat had already flown for the first time in June of 1942, weeks before that Zero was even recovered, and its design was already locked around a big engine and a tough airframe. What the captured Zero actually gave the Americans was something less cinematic and more useful: certainty. Test pilots flew it against American fighters and confirmed, in hard numbers, exactly where it was weak, exactly how fast it had to be going before its controls turned to concrete, and exactly which maneuvers it could not follow. That knowledge went straight into the tactics manuals and into the training of every naval aviator heading west. The Zero's secret was no longer a secret, and a machine built to exploit it was already sitting on Grumman's factory floor. Grumman had a reputation before the war, and it wasn't for elegance. Navy pilots called the company the Iron Works because Grumman built airplanes like it expected them to be shot. The F6F Hellcat came out of that philosophy, and it was almost the exact opposite of the Zero in every design decision. Where the Zero saved weight, the Hellcat spent it. It carried a Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, the same brutal 2,000 horsepower radial family that hauled the P-47 through Europe. It had armor around the pilot. It had self-sealing tanks that could take a bullet and keep flying. It had 650 caliber machine guns in the wings, weapons that did not need to hit an enemy for long to tear him apart, especially an enemy with no armor and unprotected fuel. It was heavier than a Zero by thousands of pounds. It could not outturn one, and Grumman never pretended it could. What it could do was climb better, dive far harder, run faster in a straight line, and absorb damage that would have killed anything the Japanese flew. And it was designed from the start for the ugly reality of carrier flying. Wide, sturdy landing gear, good visibility over the nose, forgiving handling for young pilots landing on a moving deck in bad weather. It was an airplane a 19-year-old with limited training could survive in, and America was about to produce a very large number of 19-year-olds with limited training. That, quietly, was the whole idea. Not to build a better duelist than the Zero, to build a fighter that would let an average pilot win and come home. The Hellcat reached the fleet in the summer of 1943, and the pilots flying it had been handed a rulebook written in the blood of the men who came before them. Never turn with a Zero. Never try to outmaneuver it at slow speed on its terms. Stay fast. Stay high. Come down on him, hit him once with all 6 guns, and use your speed to climb back out of reach. If he tries to follow you up, he stalls. If he tries to follow you down, his controls freeze, and you leave him behind. Paired with a tactic called the Thatch Weave, where 2 American fighters covered each other's tails by crossing paths, this turned the Zero's greatest strength into a trap. The Zero was built to win a knife fight. The Americans simply refused to have one. And now the arithmetic was running the other way. A Zero that got a burst into a Hellcat often watched it fly home anyway, armor holding, tanks sealing. A Hellcat that got a burst into a Zero usually watched it burn. The clearest single demonstration came in June of 1944 in the air battle over the Marianas. Japanese carriers launched wave after wave at the American fleet. Hellcats, guided by radar to the right altitude at the right time, met them on the way in. The Japanese formations were shredded so completely that American pilots gave the day a name that has stuck for 80 years: the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. By the end of it, Japanese naval aviation had lost hundreds of aircraft in a matter of days, and something worse than aircraft. It had lost the trained pilots to fly them, men who could not be replaced, In a war it was already losing on every other front. By the time Japan surrendered, the numbers around the Hellcat had become almost absurd. Grumman built more than 12,000 of them in about 2 years, at a pace that itself said something about the war America was fighting. Hellcats were credited with more than 5,000 aerial victories, more than any other American fighter in the Pacific, over half of all the air-to-air kills the U.S. Navy scored in the entire war. And the ratio that everyone quotes is roughly 19-1. 19 enemy aircraft claimed for every Hellcat lost in air combat. Now, honesty. That 19-1 figure comes from wartime American claims, and pilots in every air force in history have overclaimed. In the chaos of a fight, 2 men shoot at the same plane, and both count it. Post-war researchers who compared claims with actual Japanese losses concluded the true ratio was lower. It was still, by any measure, lopsided beyond argument. The Hellcat did not just beat the zero, it ended the zero as a threat. But the deeper reason is the one the numbers hide. By 1944, Japan was sending up airplanes flown by boys with a few dozen hours of training because its experienced pilots were dead, and its system had never been built to replace them at scale. America was sending up sturdy fighters flown by well-trained young men who could take a hit and go home and fly again tomorrow. The Zero had been designed to let a superb pilot dominate. The Hellcat had been designed to let an ordinary pilot survive. In a long war, only one of those ideas scales. David McCampbell finished the war as the top-scoring American naval ace with 34 aerial victories, and he flew every one of them in a Hellcat. On that October day, when he took 2 fighters up against 60 Japanese aircraft, he was not flying a machine that could outturn them. He was flying one that could outclimb them, outdive them, outshoot them, and bring him back. The Japanese pilots who dismissed American fighters at the start of the war were not stupid, and they were not entirely wrong. In 1941, they really did have the better airplane, and they really were the better trained. What they did not account for was an enemy that would study its own defeats without flinching, take a captured wreck apart to learn exactly where the perfect fighter was imperfect, and then build something ugly, heavy, and almost impossible to kill. They had built a fighter for aces. The Americans built a fighter for everyone else. And there were a great many more of everyone else. If you want more stories about the machines and the men the enemy wrote off until it was too late, subscribe. The next one is about another weapon they laughed at, right up to the day it changed the war.